On the morning of Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, a schoolmaster and part-time poet named Patrick Pearse walked through the front door of the Dublin General Post Office, placed a revolver on the counter, and informed the startled staff that the building had been seized in the name of the Irish Republic. Within minutes, the windows were barricaded with paper sacks and furniture. Men with rifles took positions at every opening, and from the front steps of the building, in the midday sun on Sackville Street, Pearse unfolded a sheet of paper and began to read aloud a document that almost no one around him had seen before. The people who stopped to listen were skeptical. Some laughed. A tram trundled past. A British cavalry patrol sent to investigate rode into rifle fire and scattered in confusion. And the Republic of Ireland, proclaimed to a city that did not ask for it, defended by roughly 600 men and women armed with a mixture of rifles, shotguns, pikes, and hurling sticks, was officially 6 minutes old. 6 days later, it was over. The leaders surrendered unconditionally. The city lay in ruins. Hundreds of civilians were dead. The population of Dublin lined the streets to jeer at the prisoners being marched to detention. A newspaper in London called the rebels misguided and criminal. Even the Irish Parliamentary Party, the dominant force in mainstream Irish politics, denounced the rising as a stab in the back. By every conventional measure, the Easter Rising of 1916 was a catastrophic defeat. And then the British government began shooting the survivors. What followed across 9 days in May 1916, 15 executions carried out in secret without defense, in the grey pre-dawn hours of a prison yard, did what 6 days of armed insurrection could not. It transformed a military failure into the founding act of a nation. It turned men who were dragged through Dublin streets to public contempt into martyrs whose names would be carved into the walls of every school in Ireland. It convinced a people who had not risen to support the rebels that the British Empire was, after all, exactly what the rebels had said it was. The Easter Rising did not win Irish independence. The executions did. And understanding the difference between those two facts is the only way to understand how 600 people with inadequate weapons, a last-minute change of plans, and no public support managed to end 800 years of British rule in Ireland. To understand what happened on Easter Monday, 1916, you need to understand what Ireland was in the years before it. Not in the abstract, not a colony or an occupied nation, but concretely in the daily lived experience of what it meant to be Irish under the British Crown at the beginning of the 20th century. Ireland had been under some form of English control since the Norman invasion of 1169. By 1800, the Act of Union had dissolved the Irish Parliament entirely and merged Ireland into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Irish Catholics, the overwhelming majority of the population, had spent generations under the penal laws, which had prohibited them from owning property above a certain value, bearing arms, holding public office, or practicing their religion openly. Though the penal laws had been progressively dismantled through the 19th century, their legacy was structural and deep. The land of Ireland was still largely owned by Protestant landlords, many of them absentees based in England. The memory of the Great Famine and post-Gorta Mór of 1845 to 1852, during which over 1 million Irish people died and another million emigrated while food continued to be exported from Ireland under British military escort, was less than a lifetime old for many people still alive in 1916. Ireland's population in 1841 had been over 8 million. By 1916, it stood at roughly 4 million and falling. The island had been depopulated on a scale unmatched anywhere else in Europe in the modern era. By 1914, Irish nationalists of all varieties had been campaigning for decades for some form of self-government. The most moderate version, Home Rule, which would have given Ireland a domestic parliament while remaining within the United Kingdom, had been passed by the British Parliament in 1914, only to be immediately suspended for the duration of the First World War. For constitutional nationalists, this was a profound betrayal. For the militant minority, who had been watching and waiting, it was confirmation that Britain would never willingly relinquish control of Ireland. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, was a secret revolutionary organization founded in 1858 with a single purpose: the establishment of an independent Irish republic by force of arms. By 1915, a 7-man military council within the IRB had begun secretly planning an insurrection timed to coincide with the ongoing war in Europe, on the principle articulated by Wolfe Tone in 1798 that England's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity. The council included Patrick Pearse, a barrister and schoolmaster with an almost mystical belief in the redemptive power of blood sacrifice; Tom Clarke, who had spent 15 of his 58 years in British prisons and still bore the physical marks of it; James Connolly, a Scottish-born trade union organiser and socialist who had built the Irish citizen army from the wreckage of the 1913 Dublin lockout; Thomas MacDonagh, a poet and academic; Joseph Mary Plunkett, who had recently returned from surgery for glandular tuberculosis; Eamon Seant, and Sion MacDiarmada, who walked with a stick as a result of polio contracted while organising for the nationalist cause. What distinguished this group from the broader Irish volunteer movement, which by early 1916 had grown to somewhere between 12 Eosanran and 16 Eosanran members, was that the military council had kept their plans almost entirely secret, even from the volunteers' own leadership. Ian McNeill, the head of the Irish Volunteers, did not know a rising was being planned until 4 days before Easter. When he found out, he issued a countermanding order cancelling the Easter Sunday mobilisations. The military council met on Easter Sunday morning at Liberty Hall, the headquarters of the Citizen Army on the Dublin Quays, and made the decision. The rising would go ahead on Monday, 1 day late, with whatever men could be assembled at short notice, without the nationwide coordinated action that had been planned, without the German arms shipment that had been intercepted by the British Navy off the Kerry coast 3 days earlier, and without the element of surprise, since the British authorities in Dublin Castle were now aware that something was coming. According to British intelligence records held at the National Archives in Kew under Series WO35, the Under-Secretary for Ireland, Sir Matthew Nathan had in fact received intelligence about the planned rising on April 17th, 1 week before Easter Monday, through intercepted German diplomatic cables decoded at Room 40 of the Admiralty. Nathan had the information. He had the time to act. He chose, after consultation with the Lord Lieutenant, to wait until after the Easter weekend before ordering mass arrests. By the time the necessary authorizations came through from the Chief Secretary in London, Pearse and his men had already taken the GPO. On Easter Monday morning, April 24th, 1916, at approximately 11:30 in the morning, a column of around 150 men marched from Liberty Hall toward the General Post Office on Sackville Street. James Connolly walked at the head of the column. Patrick Pearse walked beside him. Joseph Mary Plunkett walked a few steps behind, wearing white gauntlets and a ceremonial sword, despite the fresh surgical dressings on his neck from the operation he had undergone less than 2 weeks earlier. The men were armed with a mixture of Houthmausers, Lee Enfields, and shotguns. Some carried home-manufactured bombs, others carried pikes. The occupation of the GPO took less than 3 minutes. The staff and customers were escorted out. Barricades went up, lookouts were posted, and from the front steps, at approximately 12:45 in the afternoon, Patrick Pearse read aloud the proclamation of the Irish Republic, a document of 479 words, signed by all 7 members of the military council, which declared in its opening lines, "Irishmen and Irish women, In the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. The proclamation did something unusual for a revolutionary document. It explicitly addressed itself to Irish women as well as Irishmen. It guaranteed religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens. It pledged to cherish all the children of the nation equally. These were not incidental phrases. Connolly had helped write the document, and his influence, drawn from years of socialist and labor organizing, was visible in its commitments to equality and civil rights. This was a republic as Connolly had imagined it, not merely independent, but just. No one on Sackville Street was particularly interested. The crowd of curious onlookers that had gathered to watch dispersed fairly quickly. A contingent of British cavalry, the 6th Reserve Cavalry Regiment, stationed at Marlborough Barracks, was sent to investigate reports of trouble on Sackville Street. They rode into rifle fire from the GPO garrison. 3 horses went down. The patrol retreated in disorder. The first military engagement of the Easter Rising had lasted approximately 90 seconds. While the GPO action unfolded, other rebel units were seizing their assigned positions around the city. Edward Daly's 1st Battalion of the Irish Volunteers moved to occupy the Four Courts, the centre of the British judicial administration in Ireland. The 2nd Battalion under Thomas MacDonagh, who had been admitted to the military council only weeks before, occupied Jacob's Biscuit Factory on Bishop Street, a massively solid industrial building that proved almost impossible for the British to attack directly. Éamon Séant led the 4th Battalion to the South Dublin Union, an enormous complex of workhouse buildings that would become the site of some of the most intense close-quarters fighting of the week. Sion Houston took a small force, fewer than 30 men, to the Mendicity Institute on Usher's Island, with orders to hold it for a few hours to delay British reinforcements from crossing the Liffey. He would hold it for 2 days. Countess Constance Markievicz, a Polish-Irish aristocrat who had helped found and train the Irish Citizen Army, commanded a unit at St. Stephen's Green, alongside Michael Mallin. And in the south of the city, Eamon de Valera, a mathematics teacher born in New York to an Irish mother and a Spanish father, held Boland's Mill on Grand Canal Dock, controlling the rail approach to the city from the south. The British response was initially slow. According to WO35 records at the National Archives, the garrison in Dublin on Easter Monday had approximately 400 troops in the city and its immediate surroundings. But they were dispersed, many of them on Easter leave, and the initial confusion about the scale of the rebellion meant that coordinated action took hours to organize. The first substantial British attempt to move on the GPO was repulsed. Early attempts to retake Dublin Castle, which the rebels had chosen not to fully occupy, a decision later debated at length by military historians, were delayed. The rebels held their positions through Monday, Tuesday, and into Wednesday. The British response that would ultimately destroy the rebellion came not from infantry, but from artillery and a gunboat. The Helga, a fisheries patrol vessel commandeered by the Royal Navy, was brought up the River Liffey on Wednesday, April 26th, and began shelling rebel positions from the water. Simultaneously, British artillery deployed at Trinity College, and other positions began bombarding Sackville Street. The GPO, the symbolic heart of the rising, began to burn. By Thursday, the building was ablaze. The garrison was forced to evacuate through a hole punched in the rear wall, taking their wounded with them, retreating street by street through the burning north inner city. It was during this retreat that James Connolly was shot. According to multiple accounts in the Bureau of Military History witness statements, the archive of 773 first-person testimonies collected by the Irish government between 1947 and 1957, which remained sealed until 2003. Connolly had already been wounded once earlier in the week, hit in the left wrist during an inspection of the rebel perimeter. The second wound came on Thursday. A bullet shattered his left ankle, and lodged near the bone. Connolly refused evacuation. He was carried on a stretcher and continued directing operations from the floor, issuing orders to men leaning over him, dictating dispatches. The statement of Liam Tannum, preserved in the Bureau of Military History collection, describes Connolly being moved through the chaos of the evacuation while rebel commanders argued over what to do next. By the time the surviving GPO garrison had consolidated in a terrace of houses on Moore Street, a narrow lane of tenement buildings where the smell of burning timber drifted in through every window, it was clear to Pearce that the position was hopeless. On the afternoon of Saturday, April 29th, a nurse named Elizabeth O'Farrell walked out from the rebel position carrying a white flag. She carried a message to the British commander, Brigadier General Lowe, requesting terms. Lowe replied, "Unconditional surrender only." Pearce capitulated. Within 30 minutes, the surrender document was signed. As Connolly was carried out on his stretcher toward the British lines, he told the men around him, and the account of this exchange appears in multiple Bureau of Military History statements, not to be concerned for themselves. "Those of us who signed the proclamation will be shot," he said, "but the rest of you will be set free." He was right on the first count. He was almost entirely wrong on the second. What happened next on the streets of Dublin has been documented in detail, but it is not the part of the story that gets repeated at Irish dinner tables. As the rebel prisoners were marched from their positions to Richmond Barracks in Kilmainham, they passed through the streets of a city that was, in large part, deeply hostile to them. The Irish Times reported crowds jeering, women whose sons and husbands were serving with the British Army in France and Flanders, and there were many thousands of them. Because Ireland had sent over 200 Thousand soldiers to the British war effort, screamed abuse at the prisoners. Old vegetables and refuse were thrown. The wife of one executed insurgent later described it. The Bureau of Military History statement of Joseph O'Rourke recalls the hostile reception on the streets without editorial comment, simply as fact. It happened, the people of Dublin did not want this, and the rebels knew it. At Richmond Barracks, approximately 430 men and 79 women were eventually processed, a figure documented in the immediate post-rising British administrative records. The vast majority of them had no connection whatsoever to the rising. They had been swept up in mass roundups based on intelligence that the British authorities themselves later acknowledged was deeply unreliable. Of the 430 men arrested, 424 were released within 2 weeks after it became clear they had no involvement. Another 836, were interned without trial at camps in England and Wales, the majority of them eventually released on Christmas Eve, 1916. The decision about what to do with the leadership, the known commanders, the signatories of the proclamation, was made by General Sir John Maxwell, who had been appointed military governor of Ireland with emergency powers. On May 1st, Maxwell issued orders to begin courts-martial. The proceedings, which were governed by the Field General Court-Martial regulations, were held in secret. No defense counsel was permitted. In some cases, the officers who sat in judgment were the same officers whose units had suffered casualties fighting the rebels, a conflict of interest that the British military manual explicitly prohibited. The Crown's own law officers later ruled that the proceedings had been, in several key respects, illegal. The transcripts of these courts-martial are now preserved at the National Archives of Ireland's dedicated 1916 court-martial portal. The transcript of Patrick Pearse's trial, held on May 2nd, records his charge in the standard formula applied to nearly all the accused. Did an act, to wit, did take part in an armed rebellion and in the waging of war against His Majesty the King, such act being of such a nature as to be calculated to be prejudicial to the defence of the realm, and being done with the intention and for the purpose of assisting the enemy. The verdict was delivered in minutes. According to the court-martial record, Pierce spoke at some length. He was a trained barrister, and reportedly concluded with words that circulated widely afterward. "You cannot conquer Ireland. You cannot extinguish the Irish passion for freedom. If our deed has not been sufficient to win freedom, then our children will win it by a better deed." The three sentences handed down on May 2nd, Pierce, Tom Clark, Thomas MacDonagh, were carried out the following morning, May 3rd, before dawn in the Stonebreakers' yard at Kilmainham Jail. Clark had spent 15 years in British prisons decades earlier, convicted of Fenian conspiracy, and had endured conditions that left him with permanent damage to his hands. He told his wife, Kathleen, the night before his execution that he was relieved. He had spent his entire adult life in service to the Republican cause, and the alternative, another stretch in prison, was something he could not face. MacDonagh, who had been a published poet and the assistant headmaster at Pierce's bilingual school at St Enda's, wrote a letter the night before his execution that has been preserved. His daughter was not yet 2 years old. 4 more executions followed on May 4th. Edward Daly, 25 years old, nephew of Tom Clark, Michael O'Hanrahan. Willie Pierce, Patrick's younger brother, who by his own court-martial testimony had taken no commanding role and was, in his own words, simply a personal attaché to my brother. He was executed regardless. And Joseph Mary Plunkett, 28 years old, whose tuberculosis was advanced enough that medical opinion, documented and preserved, estimated he might not have survived another month, regardless of British action. Plunkett was married to the artist Grace Gifford at the chapel inside Kilmainham Jail at midnight on May 3rd, a wedding by candlelight in the presence of soldiers, with a 10-minute interval before Plunkett was returned to his cell and Gifford was escorted back through the prison gate. He was shot at dawn the following morning. Major John McBride was executed on May 5th. Eamon Seant, Con Colbert, Seon Houston, and Michael Mallin on May 8th. Mallin wrote to his wife on the night of May 7th, the letter is preserved, describing how he had been marched past their house, a few hundred meters from Kilmainham, on his way to his final cell. Their youngest child was 3 months old. Thomas Kent was executed in Cork on May 9th, and on May 12th, the last two, Sean MacDiarmada, who had organised the IRB's provincial network while walking with a polio stick, and James Connolly. Connolly's execution became, immediately and permanently, the symbol of what the British had done. He had been taken from Dublin Castle, where the British military had kept him under guard and medical treatment since the surrender, to Kilmainham by ambulance in the pre-dawn hours of May 12th. The wound in his ankle had developed septicemia. Medical testimony presented at the inquest that followed and preserved in British administrative records indicated that he might have had only days to live regardless of the firing squad. The British executed him anyway. Because he could not stand, he could not be placed against the execution wall. He was carried into the Stonebreakers' yard on a stretcher, lifted into a chair positioned at the corner of the yard and strapped to it. A firing squad of soldiers from the Sherwood Foresters, the regiment that had suffered the highest casualties during the week of the Rising, carried out the execution. His body, like all the others before it, was wrapped without ceremony and taken to Arbor Hill Prison, where the executed leaders were placed in a common pit and covered with quicklime. There were no coffins. There was no religious ceremony initially permitted. The families were not told where the bodies were. In the House of Commons on May 11th, one day before Connolly's execution, John Dillon, the deputy leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, the most powerful voice of constitutional nationalism in Ireland, stood up and delivered a speech that Hansard records in full. Dillon was not a Republican. He had spent his career working within the British system for Irish Home Rule, and he told the Prime Minister, "You are letting loose a river of blood, and make no mistake about it, between two of the populations who, 3 lives ago, lived as your harmonious subjects. You are washing out our whole life work in a sea of blood." Dillon warned Asquith that the executions were not suppressing rebellion, they were manufacturing it. The speech was met, the Hansard record shows, with interruptions and hostility from the Conservative benches. The British Prime Minister himself was concerned. Asquith had warned Maxwell repeatedly to exercise restraint. After Connolly's execution, the remaining 75 death sentences were commuted, but the damage had already been done across 9 days of the Stonebreakers' yard. The transformation of Irish public opinion that followed the executions has been analysed by historians for over a century, and the mechanism is not difficult to understand. The rebellion itself had been disruptive, destructive, and unwanted. Large parts of Dublin's north inner city were in ruins. Hundreds of civilians, documented in coroners' records and death registers, had been killed in crossfire, or by snipers, or by British artillery and naval bombardment that made no distinction between rebel positions and the tenement houses of the poorest neighbourhoods in the city. The Irish public had legitimate grievances against the people who had brought this down on them. But the executions were different. They were slow. They were deliberate. They were secret. They killed men who had already surrendered. Men who, by any of the rules that governed the conduct of war in Europe in 1916, might reasonably have expected to be treated as prisoners. They killed Willie Pearce for being his brother's sibling. They strapped a dying man to a chair and shot him through the chest because he had signed a piece of paper. They took the bodies and buried them in quicklime, as if erasing the men entirely was the point of the exercise. The Royal Commission on the Rebellion in Ireland, established by Parliament and reporting in 1916, its proceedings preserved in British parliamentary papers, concluded that the British administration in Ireland had been characterised by want of foresight and lack of preparation. It made no comment on the executions. The report's dry bureaucratic language stands in stark contrast to the testimonies being collected simultaneously by ordinary Irish people about what they had witnessed. The broader political consequences unfolded methodically. The surviving leaders of the Rising, De Valera, Markievicz, and the roughly 1,800 men interned at Frongoch internment camp in Wales, used their detention as, in Connolly's own prior formulation, a university of revolution. At Frongoch, the interned men organised, trained, debated, and built networks. Among them was a 25-year-old Cork man named Michael Collins, who had fought in the GPO as a junior officer and aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett. Collins observed carefully, made contacts, and began planning. In the general election of December 1918, the first held in Ireland after the end of the First World War, Sinn Féin, the party most closely associated with the Rising and the Republican movement, won 73 of Ireland's 105 parliamentary seats. The Irish Parliamentary Party, which had dominated Irish politics for a generation, was virtually annihilated. The Sinn Féin MPs refused to take their seats in Westminster, instead meeting in Dublin in January 1919 as Dáil Éireann, the Assembly of Ireland, and formally ratifying the proclamation of 1916. The Irish War of Independence began that same month. It lasted until July 1921. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921, negotiated in part by Michael Collins, who had never forgotten the lessons of Frongoch, established the Irish Free State. 26 of Ireland's 32 counties achieved self-governance for the first time since 1800. The 6 counties of the northeast remained within the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland, a partition that would define Irish politics, culture, and violence for the rest of the 20th century. Patrick Pearse, in the text of the proclamation that he read from the steps of the GPO on April 24, 1916, wrote a line that is less often quoted than the famous opening. "We place the cause of the Irish Republic under the protection of the Most High God, whose blessing we invoke upon our arms, and we pray that no one who serves that cause will dishonour it by cowardice, inhumanity, or rapine. The men who wrote and signed that document did not expect to survive. Tom Clark, who had spent 15 years in British prisons and knew the machinery of imperial punishment better than any of them, told his wife the night before his execution that he had always known it would end this way. James Connolly, being carried out on his stretcher through the ruins of the GPO, told the men around him that the signatories would be shot. He was right. What he may not have calculated precisely was the arithmetic of what those executions would produce. The 9 days in the stonebreaker's yard that did what 6 days of occupation could not. The bodies at Arbor Hill were eventually honored. In 1956, a formal memorial garden was established at the site. The quicklime pit became a place of state commemoration. The GPO, rebuilt, became one of the most recognizable buildings in Ireland. The proclamation, of which only a handful of original printed copies survive, one is held at the National Library of Ireland, is reproduced on schoolroom walls, on commemorative plaques, and in the preamble to the Irish Constitution of 1937. And in the Stonebreaker's Yard at Kilmainham Jail, which is now a national museum, 2 black crosses mark the 2 spots where the executions took place. The cross at the far end of the yard marks where 14 men were shot, standing up. The cross at the near end, in the corner, marks where a chair was placed on May 12, 1916, for a man who had been born in Edinburgh to Irish immigrant parents, who had left school at 10 to become a labourer, who had spent a lifetime organising workers across 3 continents for the simple proposition that they deserved to eat and to govern themselves, and who was dying already when the firing squad arrived. In 1916, a rising that lasted 6 days and was watched by many Dubliners with contempt ended with an unconditional surrender. The men who led it had known they would lose. Pearse had written, months before Easter Monday, about the necessity of a blood sacrifice. The idea, drawn partly from religious tradition and partly from a reading of Irish history, that only the death of martyrs could revive a cause that had been too long deferred. He was not wrong about the arithmetic. He was simply wrong about where the sacrifice would come from. It was not the rebels who died in the fighting that changed Ireland. It was the men who died in the chair and against the wall, at dawn, in a yard where the sun never reached. The British Empire, which had withstood the Fenian risings, the land wars, the demands of the Irish Parliamentary Party, and the opposition of millions of Irish people across decades of constitutional agitation, was brought to the negotiating table not by the 6 days of the Easter Rising, but by the 9 days of the executions that followed. Every empire contains, somewhere in its machinery, the mechanism of its own undoing. In Ireland in May 1916, that mechanism was a chair in a prison yard and a commanding general who did not know when to stop.